Okay, let me kind of work through this. It's another one of those topics where I feel like I should spend some time on it, do some notes, and I feel like that is something that I want to put on my to-do list. But I think I'll just try to force myself to talk through it. How would I even introduce the topic? So I've been thinking about it in terms of the scriptures and what it's this question of idols. So idols come up a lot, and in association with these ideas of idols is questions of involvement in idolatrous religions and other types of associations of which are used to support that whole system of interaction. So what's in the backdrop of my mind that I'm reminded of as I'm thinking about this is this passage I just referred to, 2 Kings 21, I believe, where it talks about Manasseh. It's some of the various evil kings in the divided Israel. And at that point in time, that chapter makes reference to King Manasseh, which is one of the evil kings. And it produces somewhat of almost like a list of the things that he had been involved in, which are along the lines of idolatrous worship, idolatrous acts, which include horrific things like burning his children in the fire, like sacrificing them basically to these idolatrous gods. And then in association to all of this is his type of mentorship involves certain types of seers, or those associated that people would associate with like witchcraft and stuff like that, or like astrology, things like that. It's such a involved topic that a person, for me, I feel like in the past I've touched on these topics, but it is really important in terms of addressing religion, because there's this portion of the fear of spirits or evil or superstition that has to be addressed when going into the significance of questioning what's going on and what's being cautioned against, and then to what degree, because some associations with things, some of the passages in scripture later on get really confusing, because eventually it comes across as what was once prohibited then is allowed. And so how do they make that transition? I don't think I'm going to resolve that right now, for one, because it just, it's not, I don't have enough time to do that. And so I'll have to come back to it later. I guess I'm just kind of processing my mind in this certain file that I've been wanting, or I've been curious about. And so it involves all of those things, like why eventually in some instances it seems that it's okay, and then in other instances it's absolutely no involvement, or it leads to these horrific things. And along those lines then, so we're talking about idolatry and acts associated with idolatrous religions that are prohibited, and then also involvement in some types of certain cultural practices that could seem associated with maybe to some degree idolatry, and unto a type of possible false god or things like that. And then there's these questions of making reference or request unto like angels or spirits. And then the question, is it wrong to make those requests to angels or spirits? Or what about worship in a form of take, for example, so some of these little clips that I'd seen, I don't feel like I've watched enough to adequately have a say. But so just speaking kind of on the surface here, this discussion among some Islamic contributors where they're trying to work out how they relate to the character Jesus, and some disagreements within some Christian interpretation as to what Jesus represents, whether he's God or what type of messenger of God is Jesus, and is it then prohibited under Islam to appear to be in support of a type of worship unto Jesus, or how is that differentiated, or how does one approach Jesus? Is it likened to seeking guidance from like an angel or a spirit, as opposed to just going straight to God? So just all of these questions. And so then would that be considered idolatrous? With some of what I talked about, that really long conversation that I talked about before, I forget what I titled it, but it had to do with a follow-up to this question as to whether Christians and Muslims could coexist, or Christianity and Islam could coexist. And I basically said yes, and then I discussed these this certain approach to looking at scripture and the kingdoms, and the freedom from the accumulations of the temple, and the improper power dominions of the kingdoms, and a variety of other things going on there, and the association that you see with the money systems obstructing various groups access to life sources and whatnot. So anyway, I unpacked that in that long discussion. And so along those lines, what I was kind of trying on as an interpretive approach to the scriptures was that the temple eventually absorbs other types and likenesses within it, but then it becomes like a transformative mechanism on the world stage within world dominions. And I was suggesting that it was the intention was that this transformative mechanism functioning through the temple wouldn't take on a competing kingdom power, but would be transformative as absorbed within dominant kingdoms. But eventually then Israel had taken upon itself a likeness of the kingship. So then eventually gets caught up in both negotiating among kingdom powers and the work of the temple and whatnot, till eventually that part is kind of pulled back, and then eventually it's, at the time of the exile, then the remnant of the temple practice goes into or is absorbed by the world powers. Anyway, so reiterating that, because I'm going to try to explain a little bit in reference to how I had explained that kind of approach of characters in story, like the kingdoms, the temple, the life source mechanisms which get involved in the money. But then we have to think about the spiritual acts in relation to where we see the need to transform idolatrous worship and the caution of it, without getting too much into the hyper religiosity of which becomes gridlocked when we see at the time of Jesus, where they're not seeing the spiritual distinction because it had accumulated into all these complex regulations and whatnot. So I think if you kind of imagine what are the things that are being solved, so along the line, some of the things that are eventually being solved is entering into the accumulation of excess that has something to do with these interactions, but also what these interactions result in reference to degrees of taking one's life And so there's, whether it be the kingdom power, like the force over people, the money, or the temple, and all these associations, there's these degrees of its effect on life, the spirit of life, the animation, that involve a variety of things like murder, killing, death, stealing, exploiting, communication through lying, like that we see like with the Ten Commandments and stuff like that. Kind of gives us this kind of gauge of starting to recognize some of the error from the way that the system and all these pieces are stacked together. And so if you kind of recall in the book of Genesis, then some of this, getting into this type of system which is warned against, is introduced as a type of confusion, right? The whole thing is kind of confused. And then it just exponentially gets even more confused and involves in all of these relational dilemmas and whatnot. So anyway, let me challenge myself to try to simplify this. So at some level, some of what eventually is portrayed as attempting to be resolved is that it's eventually recognized that there are less requirements toward this ability to realign with God. Some of the when it's mixed up into this whole development of obstruction, confusion, accumulation, societal hostilities, a lot of the added on regulations are to help guide people into practices to begin to pull back the layers and work through the accumulation and then resolve it. And so when you're thinking about the idea of, for one, the idea of idols in the story associates with eventually what people think is required toward God. And they start practicing. You see that within certain examples, it doesn't just happen just immediately. It starts to become a development of things. You see that with the divided kingdom and some of these other examples where they take on certain behaviors of grown complexity, and then it just causes them to seek for quick forms of guidance, which they seek out different seers. Eventually, what's kind of interesting there, so I'm all over the place here. Let me try to get a little order to this. So if you make reference to 2 Kings 21, and it talks about the things that the evil king did, is so it talks about the idols and the acts eventually as it developed into the heights of this error. Then he was practicing. He must have felt the requirement from this form of interpreting God to sacrifice his sons. And it says that he had gotten even worse than how the people were before they were called to go in and transform the land. And then it also says that he was associating with astrologers and seers and things like that. But I feel like if you kind of pull back some of the layers, you could see that he was involved in all of these things and much more. He killed the prophets. He was just enacting a full evil regime kingdom. So if you try to unpack it, though, there are times where you could imagine if a person wasn't on this course of developing into this evil these evil ways, then if they just kind of overlap with some involvement of other groups, and they like take for instance make reference to these like astrologers and different ones and seers. When Jesus, the story of Jesus being born in Bethlehem is referenced as the beginnings of a new type of ushering in of a distinction, a child being born that would help usher in the new kingdom and whatnot. And because it's such a pivotal time, at least the way it tells the story, it attracts those that are involved in seeking and being aware of that type of emphasis on the world stage. And so it attracts these, they say like the wise men could potentially have been involved in things like possibly a form of astrology or reading the times or things like that. It also attracts, because it attracts these different people from these different walks of life, and then they go and they visit them and they honor Jesus and give gifts to the family and whatnot. And so what you kind of find there is that there's these people that are involved in at least attempting to seek and read the times, and they end up drawing their attention to this thing that was like, at least in the story, like a legitimate thing that was happening, a legitimate change, and it just ends up drawing their attention to it. And so it kind of seems to give you this connotation that it isn't always just that you stumble into some type of sharing of space or questions among these types of people. Because there's also times where like other people, they find themselves in company of these types of people as well. And they trade ideas. It becomes discourse. And so whether it be like in the works of Josephus or even like in the book of Daniel or different times, there's these examples where kings will bring forth seers or different people, those that are kind of trying to communicate and read the times, those that are offering the patterns of what or how they're seeing things, and then they deliberate and they have discourse and they trade ideas. And so it doesn't seem like some of these ways that people propose reading the times or checking patterns or proposing ideas or sharing in a communication with you to share ideas isn't always bad on its own, but it doesn't mean that the people are really giving you a clear word. For me, I kind of just feel like some of that stuff is that there are certain kind of components in life and certain patterns, and sometimes people are just seeking for ways to kind of get the wheels turning and share patterns and ideas and whatnot. Whereas if you associate someone that is seeking to help you generate ideas and offer you patterns, and then you accept it, if you're already intending, if you have this whole collection of things that you're doing, whether it be idolatrous acts, idolatrous practices that are really entrenched in like horrific things that God obviously doesn't require of you to do, but you're confused and you're doing these things, or you're seeking to fuel other types of like your skewed animations. And on top of that, you have you're surrounding yourself with bad counsel and people that are just helping you become more entrenched, like encouraging that entrenchment, then it all just kind of flows together into this whole unit of something that is helping you solidify your error even more so. So I was just trying to say that to have a distinction between when some of those components are not working toward that trajectory, they could just be kind of in the peripheral of something they could be even almost like a temperament of people that are just sensitive to the times and function as some type of counsel. You could almost even say it as like this king had the intention to go in a bad way. He was corrupting his investments. He was corrupting his practices. And he drew around him counsel that would give him, that would just justify what he wanted to hear. Like, so, you know, so you can kind of maybe say it like that. I guess I just say that too because some people can really get into overcorrecting, I guess you would say, like on those that have like are involved in these various types of practices and whatnot. I personally though, and what it also seems like the scriptures read as though is continuing to try to get people away from looking first to these peripheral things that should just be like support topics. And so you see with like Jesus, it represents a new centering of something, this child, this new leader being born, and these other and so that's the animating force of like at the time, like the part of the distinctive centering of where a spiritual revelation would arise from is this represented in the child, and then the people visiting and being attracted to it are peripheral supporting testimony or supporting characters unto that standard, I guess you would say, or that area of emphasis. I think what's different is when people are not seeking for what like the emphasis or standard is, which you would say would be like the path of God or whatnot. And instead they're looking at the peripheral things to I guess like instead try to create a different emphasis or something to that effect. Basically, like some of these other things are just should like concur to what the path is. Even for instance, like in the New Testament, when the disciples and Jesus are on their journey, some of those sensitive in their spirit, the seers and whatnot, follow along in the peripheral in the crowd and kind of yell out things that seem somewhat accurate, but are just not in the right timing of it. And so, like the disciples correct them about making their proclamations because it's not really in like a relational connection to them. It's like they're on the peripheral. And so they don't say that it's not true. It's just that the things that they're saying are being brought up in the crowd and not really as like concurring in a relational connection to the proper timing of the things that they're saying and revealing. Anyway, though, my point there, though, was that it's not that some of the things weren't concurring to the times. And so I do think there is something to looking at scripture, though, and this challenge to a major point of the scriptures is staying in the path of where God is growing the revelation. And so it's kind of this caution of don't look to things that are not really a part of the path of where revelation is going. And the question, if a person finds themselves doing that, then it's kind of an indicator to get back into like refining so you can kind of see clearly. And usually, so this kind of gets back to what I was saying about understanding some of the parameters of the stories on the kingdom level, like the money or economy level, like the resources, because the economy and resources that move and shift through life are also told as certain times of famine and things like that, like the currency of life, resources. And then like the temple, in the spiritual processes that are involved in the work of the temple and whatnot, which also involves like the blood accounts and spiritual centering and spiritual guidance, stuff like that. And so when you start seeing certain parameters, then it kind of helps give you, I don't know, maybe a little bit of like checks and balances of when people are starting to seek and they're trying to discern what they're seeking, then looking to see like, is this like where's a person at in their kingdom level of stuff? Where are they at in the temple processes stuff, which is like a ability to be centered on God and accessing the processes of that, and then what effects are like the economy or resources pertaining to them. And so taking those into account, then scanning yourself or a person or even looking at a character in the scripture when they're looking toward, say, like a seer or an idol, or being drawn into idolatrous practices, where are those other portions out of balance? So are you obstructed through resources? And so then what? Then do you have to like navigate through the kings, or is the temple corrupt? And then what? So you're looking at these things, and like when you are seeking, because usually when they're seeking, it's an indicator in the story if they're seeking for a seer, because sometimes it's legitimate. Sometimes when they're seeking, they match up with like a prophet or someone that actually does have those abilities, that sensitivity or that discernment or what have you, and it's useful to them. And so a lot of times when the character is looking for something like that, they're looking for this like guidance and communication. They're looking for spiritual guidance. And at some point you see that happen often. Also with kings. You'll hear that in old stories too, where kings will be ruminating and trying to figure stuff out. And so they call to themselves seers, or people that have that sensitivity. But they gauge the information and consider it against the, I guess, checks and balances of whatever their standards are and whatnot. So along those lines, I guess something that you could maybe consider is like, when it's cautioning against how you concur with like your spiritual counsel guidance, how is that like to what extent is that clear guidance? I guess you can kind of gauge that. And does it allow you to, like, is it encouraging the refining of all of the other components to be in better, improved alignment as well? Or is it escapism? And so, but then also when you're looking at the story and the other aspects that it cautions is idol worship. So basically like an idol would be something that a person makes as like a reference point for how they're constructing the building and developing of their life in reference to these various components. So it becomes the center point of their life. And it's suggesting in the story that anytime there's an idol that isn't God, like that God's the mystery force of life. So the way that we start understanding God as well is like this, the source of life, the life source, like the tree of life, what have you. And so anytime something else is in that position, that becomes an idol. And then the attributes of that idol will start to be revealed on the things that it requires that you have to do for it. And then the story is suggesting that anytime there's an idol that isn't the actual life source of God, it eventually, the way you start building your life starts to be skewed or out of alignment, then requiring you to perceive that you have all these requirements from God. And so then it creates over time an error. All these different things and the factors that flow into it that I was talking about just become off base, to the point where all of them together start developing the involvement of each of these, to where some portions on their own maybe wouldn't be that bad, but when they're all together and it's like caught up in this whole trajectory, then they all can like lead into this corrupt, you become a corrupt kingdom unto yourself, off base, and then behaving and taking upon yourself the belief that you're required to do all of these other things, which are actually very much out of line with God, and become anti to what God is actually about, and anti to what would otherwise be attributes of God had you been centered on God. And so then that becomes also this question of eventually as well, like questioning the things that we perceive as requirements to be centered on God. One of the major indicators in the scriptures as to why they caution so much about idolatry is because in the story, the result of idolatry and the idols that were being worshipped and the requirements that they were deceived into believing were requirements from God, which also were generated because of these blood accounts and other animations and unresolved historical, like a type of hauntings of the land and stuff like that, just became a confusion as to how to appease these grown kingdoms and like skewed kingdoms. And so basically they would eventually have these horrific beliefs of requirement to appease God, which would involve things like sacrificing your children as like burnt sacrifices in the fire, other types of sacrifice, but it's not as though it automatically becomes that, it develops into that. There's also this other type of pattern in scripture where it talks about kingdoms growing to the fullness of their sin. And so we also find there is that there's room to like work out, basically there isn't this expectation of perfection as much as there's certain components that can kind of be gauged as if someone doesn't get a handle on refining and maturing and growing in their life, eventually it could reach to the heights of the worst portions of like the outcome of idolatrous acts and whatnot. So basically like there's room in between the full development of the error and like a room to have corrective measures and whatnot. I think like one of the main points about so idolatry, so of course there's the major obvious problem of at the height of idolatry, sacrificing children and having these extreme beliefs of requirement to God that eventually are revealed as just absolutely false. Like God does not require those types of things. So in that aspect, it's obvious that that would be something people would say that cannot be allowed in like civilized society or developments of kingdoms and whatnot. So it's not too difficult for people to understand why that there would be a corrective measure for civilizations that are practicing child sacrifice and saying that it's a requirement. But what about lesser things where it's not so obvious, it's not like automatically like something horrific like child sacrifice or what have you, where people might consider other religious beliefs or cultures or various practices as being attributed possibly to other gods or what have you. It does get a little tricky because some people will say, well, if you don't believe that there are other gods, then perhaps you don't even believe that any of the like the other things are bringing any type of empowerment, like say some kind of ritual or something, or bringing any kind of empowerment to any other gods, because you simply just don't believe that. And so maybe you personally have this freedom to practice various things that maybe other people might associate as attributed to some other god, but you know, maybe simply just don't even believe that. That's kind of reminiscent of the teachings of Paul when he is trying to explain to people when they feel like they didn't have freedom to behave, like to engage in some stuff in the shared like public square, the marketplace, because they had felt like some practices overlap with other spiritual practices. And so Paul is just kind of explaining, well, like long story short, like for some people they know that it's nothing, and so they can participate in the shared marketplace and some of these involvements and not feel like they're involved in anything, and other people they can't. And so he does explain that at some level it's more of a spiritual maturity where you can realize that you can, like, you don't have to worry about stumbling into certain practices or behaviors because you simply know that it's not being attributed to like some other god, or that's not what you're believing in and what have you. So that kind of gets into some nitty gritty about like some like a spiritual superstition and stuff like that. People, I'm sure, will still have their disagreements because they'll say, well, some things you do might empower something whether you know it or not. I think that would be a longer discussion on the ideas of what's behind the idea of somebody considering something having some power on its own without other interaction. But yeah, I think that like that's a longer discussion to unpack that. I guess take for instance, like when people will say like some object has some kind of animated curse on it, whether you know it or not, and you have absolutely no intention as to its association or not. That's like a longer discussion, I guess, on probably things like demonology and stuff like that. I guess though, if I were to say something quickly about that, if somebody asked me and if I were just being honest with where I'm at, I personally don't put too much into the idea that an isolated object has certain power on its own. I mean, I do have a lot of examples throughout my life of people giving examples of, I mean, I know people believe that. But yeah, like, and so I would give respect for other people's opinions and beliefs on that. But I generally just, for myself, don't personally believe that. I tend to think that, so this is just like a quick approach to this. Instead of like going into like deep spiritual, like the spiritual demonology or, you know, things like that. I tend to think that when we get stories like in scripture, when it talks about physical objects, physical things like ritual and things like that, like it says that, like the law, which the law includes a variety of other practices. The law is made for man, not made for God. And eventually what we find is that objects and things can start to be used as practices that we gain, that we could use as like examples for gaining certain habits that bring us closer to God or help us to learn and reveal attributes of God to help teach us. But in and of themselves, they're not really power. If our minds and our hearts are not really transformed, or if we haven't done work to like surrender, like work through certain things to surrender them and lay them to rest within us, other things could probably function as like an outward mechanism to possibly strum the places of unresolved within us. Possibly. But generally in that sense, what would be giving it any type of a sense of power is our areas of unresolve, our areas where we haven't worked out surrender or better alignment in our life. There's also some other things like objects can help to remind us to hold on to other areas within us where maybe there's more spiritual confidence, or to remind us to stay kind of be fixed on a spiritual guidance or whatnot. And then once we hold to ideas of confidence, then it kind of centers us a little bit more and situates our life a little bit more. And so outward things can help to prompt that in us. Outward things can prompt or invoke certain things that kind of just strum us. And the degree to which it does reveals more about the work we either have or haven't done in our lives. On another note, to get back to the idea though of I think some of the caution through scripture that it really had against the whole corrective measure of the kingdom, the temple, and the other types of interaction, and to be against idolatrous ways, is this attempt to have us focus on the eventual, during it, to stay focused on a distinctive path of growth and to not get confused into these extremes, but then eventually to stay fixed on setting things up to where it could set in motion this fully transformative interaction of these certain points. And so it had to kind of put the pressure on to keep it going. But I feel like once it had gotten to the point where things had been set in motion on more of a transformative area of emphasis, intersecting with the temple, the kingdoms, the economy, etc., once it kind of hit that point of a more transformative kind of benchmark, then I feel like it allowed for some portions, once that was more set in motion and stabilized enough to a degree, there's this room to have some great, a room for grace to kind of work things out. And along those lines, some of the main point in really resisting idolatrous ways and whatnot was to kind of get to that shift, that kind of pivot point to where we could reach that stage of a transformative approach and understanding, and then start setting in motion, getting to the point of realizing that God doesn't require all of these excessive things. And so one of the main points, I think, as well, that humanity, it just really set this standard, set in motion, that humanity would continue to be challenged as to what we keep thinking are requirements for God. And so there is some level of, maybe truth in people challenging whether something is a requirement or not. And the more we increasingly get challenged, we are realizing a lot of stuff that we had kept thinking was a requirement from God, it's becoming less and less and less and less. And I tend to think that it'll continue to be shed away more and more and more until we realize we're simply just human beings present before the life force and functioning through our lives. And so it's not so much that we're asking which religious requirements that we keep and which ones do we don't, I tend to think that we're going to continue to have the felt requirements continue to be like chiseled away or refined away as we inhabit just the presence and the attributes of God, which, like Jesus talked about, is like love and the spiritual attributes of God and simply just the presence of us in our being. So then the question is, though, okay, we're not to that point yet, though. A lot of religious beliefs still think that a variety of these things are still required. And it's maybe not even so much that we're trying to figure out which ones are requirements and which ones aren't, as much as starting to understand that we'll probably all have to give up some of the things that we think are requirements and they're not. Within all world religions. So then the question is, okay, well, we're not ready for that yet, so we have to give each other grace. And so what does that level of grace look like as we're continuing to refine those things? And so what's error and what isn't? Like this question of putting on practices that are not requirements for God. And there may be like cultural practices. And then what's the difference between some cultural practices that do help give us skills to help us learn about God, but maybe aren't like requirements for God. And I think maybe that's where it's a category where religion, in trying to be obedient to God, to not get involved in idolatrous things, is maybe getting too much into unnecessary religious prohibition or too fearful of idolatrous behavior, that it's not understanding there's room to work through other cultural expressions as ways to understand using it through cultural expression to teach people about attributes of God. And so there are things we're, in the storyline at least, if we're learning about God, is that for one, God is like the centering life force. But then some of the stuff we're starting to learn about God is learning to take on the attributes of God. And so some cultural expressions or just some outward expressions, or even like the ceremony, like religious ceremony, a lot of these things are not requirements per se of God, as much as things that we learn to help us take on the attributes of God. So like the attributes of God, like love, joy, peace, God is love, the spirit of love, etc., stuff like that. And so even if you're imagining like counseling sessions and whatnot, if you're trying to have kind of like your spiritual centering or being guided into wisdom for centering your life and improving your life, you're taking on practices to teach you revelation about God. And so, maybe it's some of those things that could be considered. And I think also there's a difference between, so say like this question possibly of, can people ask angels for something that they should rather just ask God for? And maybe a different way of thinking about it is like looking at scripture, sometimes the angel characters are revealing a message, like they're giving you a revelation. They're delivering a message that you have to deliberate yourself on and discern between. And so maybe it isn't so much that you're like worshiping an angel, but maybe you're rejoicing on epiphany of a message. I think that's different than than like worshiping it as the source, as God or something. And so I do think that there are different degrees of people that could be in the spirit of helping to reveal God to you or to deliver a revelatory message to you. And you're not worshiping them. You're taking that information and you're bringing it into your files of seeking to learn more about God, and then you're like refining that. And then I think too the idea of, say, like worshiping Jesus and whatnot, what it causes me to think about is this idea that Jesus is likened to the temple, and within the temple was the Ark of the Covenant, so like the house of God. It's likened to, say for instance, like in the Old Testament when there was the temple and the Ark of the Covenant was placed within the temple, and then it was like a meeting place to like process your revelation and alignment and learning unto God. So it was like a reference point as unto God. And what I'm also reminded of is when King David, there was a reverence that they had toward the Ark of the Covenant because it was a place where like God would manifest his revelation as being like revealed among creation unto man and whatnot. And once that was established through a lot of different like interactions, there was a certain reverence. And it also, as it coincided with like the path of life and whatnot. So anyway, there's this point in the story where King David, after going through a lot of growth and seeking and having this connection unto God, then he wants to honor the Ark of the Covenant because it's that which represents their guidance and revelation and obedience as to the way that God is teaching people to start to learn about God. And as he is going through, so he eventually wants to go and build a proper location for it and honor it. And so they're transporting it, and they have to kind of have this whole ceremonial way that they transport it properly. And as they're doing that, he along this as they're delivering it and they're on this journey, he like breaks out in a type of like worship and ceremonial dance and whatnot. And some people, I think different ones around him are like, what are you doing? I guess his wife is like, you're acting crazy. What does she even say? She says like he's behaving vulgar or whatever, because he breaks out in this like worship dance. But anyway, so I'm thinking about that story in terms of like someone might say, well, was he worshiping this box? Like, was like David worshiping this like physical box? But what he's worshiping is the revelation, the path of revelation that box represents. And so I think in that sense, also when people get excited about Jesus, in that sense, they're excited about, in reference to Jesus, the path that Jesus represents in revealing God, in revealing further revelation of God. And since Jesus is likened to the temple, and reveals to us that God is within us, likened to the Ark of the Covenant was in the temple, then as we join into this like template of realizing that God is within us and we're animated by it, I think that's what people are joining into, like this. It's the revelation of like when they imagine Jesus, they're concurring that God is within us. There's the ability that God is within us. And so they're worshiping the path of that revelation, if that makes sense. Anyway, that's kind of a lot. I feel like I was like all over the place with that, sorting my thoughts out. I'll give it some time to think about it, and then maybe kind of get back to the ideas of some of these other topics that are involved in this as well.